In the early 20th century, the concept of eugenics was widely accepted and practiced across the US. Mental asylums were widespread, and cruel methods of dealing with those who were considered feeble minded were considered effective at the time. In 1927, the Supreme Court debated Buck v. Bell, ruling that public institutions should be able to sterilize their inmates who were considered feeble minded. Approximately 30,000 people were sterilized after Buck, and sterilization laws would continue to decline until the 1940s. Buck v. Bell was ultimately repealed, however, the decision was never actually overturned. The term eugenics was coined by Francis Galton in 1883, who was influenced by Charles Darwin's theory on natural selection. He believed that society should encourage people with superior genes to be able to reproduce. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, mental asylums were widespread across the United States, and cruel methods of treatment to deal with those who were thought to be feeble minded were considered effective by the medical system at the time. In 1920, fitter family contests were introduced as a way of demonstrating positive eugenics, or in other words, encouraging the fit to have larger families and the unfit to not. Forced sterilization was a way for the government to ensure that those with lesser genes could not breed. In the 1880s, sterilization was practiced on inmates in prisons, however, it did not become a mandatory practice until the early 20th century. In 1907, Indiana passed its first sterilization law that would make it mandatory for criminals, rapists, and people with mental disabilities to be sterilized. This lasted until 1909, when Governor Thomas R. Marshall halted the law. In 1921, the Indiana Supreme Court repealed the law, saying that it was unconstitutional. States like Washington, Connecticut, and California followed suit in 1909, as did many other states. A woman by the name of Laura Little organized an anti-sterilization group that was also formed from her anti-vax beliefs to oppose Oregon's compulsory sterilization law in 1913. Resistance was often limited to local or regional due to the nature of these laws. In the case of Buck v. Bell, John Bell wanted to sterilize a woman named Carrie Buck for having a child in a mental institution. The case was a way to test an act made by the Supreme Court in 1924 called the Virginia Eugenical Act. In 1927, the same year as the case, Carrie Buck was selected as a test subject to see how legitimate the act was. The main argument against Carrie was that because she was a feeble minded woman, she shouldn't be allowed to have children because she would just produce defective offspring. The case was voted 8 to 1. Almost everyone in this case was against Carrie: her social worker, her elementary school teachers, the hospital staff of the institution, and several eugenicists who were considered professional scientists who were brought as witnesses, as well as other medical professionals. Carrie's lawyer, Irene Whitehead, did very little in her defense, as he was in relation with the two eugenicists on the case, Urbery Strode and Albert Pridey. Justice Oliver Holmes was the Supreme Court justice who wrote the case, and his opinion on it is made quite clear: three generations of imbeciles are enough. This case allowed people to be forcefully sterilized because they were considered burdens to society. This was a huge win for the eugenics movement, who thought their way of medical practice would be effective for humanity's survival. Carrie Buck's lawyer, Irene Whitehead, was bragging after the case of how this case is in the best shape it could be to go to the United States Supreme Court. There was possibly one Supreme Court justice who was against this ruling, but his stance was not written. Justice Pierce Boutler was a devout Catholic and the only one who distanced himself from the decision, but his stance was not written. Approximately 30,000 people were sterilized after Buck, and 8,300 people in Virginia alone. This lasted to the 1930s until the 1942 case, Skinner versus Oklahoma, that sterilization was starting to decline and eugenics was becoming more of a debate on opposing sides. During the Nuremberg trials, several Nazis based their defense off of the decision of Buck v. Bell. Things started to progress for disabled people in the United States. Mental asylums were starting to close down in the 1960s, and mental health was starting to be understood stood in the 1970s. Buck v. Bell was repealed in 1974, but it was never actually overturned. While sterilization was certainly slowing down, it never actually ended. There have been reports from California prisons that female inmates have been sterilized, and in the 1970s, indigenous women have been reportedly sterilized without their consent. Even when sterilization is illegal, it still happens behind closed doors. This decision truly was a mark of eugenics in the United States, people being sterilized and not being allowed to have children simply because they were considered lesser. It is also an important event to look back on and make sure something like it never happens again.